Welcome. This is the next lecture in the Cold War unit. It's called The Cold War Gets Hot, and it's about our relationship with China and Korea. Sorry about the music there. It'll go away in a second. All right. So, when it comes to China, remember there's a history there with the United States. The Chinese had fought against the Japanese in World War II. Now, they were having a civil war before World War II broke out. So within China, there were two groups, one of them being communist and one of them not communist. And so they were fighting, but then Japan invaded China. And so the two sides of the Chinese stopped fighting against each other and started fighting against the Japanese. And we had helped them to do that. In fact, we had told Japan, stop invading and stop provoking the Chinese. We wanted to trade with them. And remember, that's kind of how the background of Pearl Harbor was. The reason Japan bombed us is because we were interfering in what they wanted to do in China. So we already had some relationship with China, and during the war, China helped us fight and against the Japanese. And so there was, we obviously didn't like working with the communists, but at the time, neither the communists nor the nationalist Chinese were in control. So they were both working together against the Japanese. In China, there were two leaders. One, Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of the communists, and Mao Zedong was, Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of the nationalist Chinese government, and Mao Zedong was the leader of the communist group that wanted to take control of China. So both of these leaders were working with the United States. And we actually thought of Chiang Kai-shek as a friend. He was not communist. And remember, we don't like communism. And the whole Cold War is capitalism and democracy against communism. So it would make sense that we would be more friendly with Chiang Kai-shek than Mao Zedong, who represented or was the leader of the Communist Party. Now remember, communism is always more attractive to the lower classes because it promises economic equality. And so if you don't have much, that sounds pretty good. So Mao had the majority of people on his side, but the United States government was not in favor of communism, and they were going to try and help suppress that. So in 1949, let's see, we're waiting here, Mao defeated Chiang Kai-shek. Now remember, World War II ended in 1945. So over the next 4 years, Mao and Chiang Kai-shek go back to fighting the civil war that they were fighting before the war. And while we helped Chiang Kai-shek and we provided support and we provided weapons and we provided surveillance and that kind of stuff, we never sent troops and we didn't bomb and we didn't become actively involved in their civil war, because that's something the United States says they don't do. We were involved, but just not directly. So this is a typical Cold War kind of fight where there's going on inside of a country. But when Mao Zedong and his people defeated Chiang Kai-shek and communism took over China, it was seen as a defeat in the Cold War against the United States. And like, Truman, what are you doing? You're supposed to be, you said, the Truman Doctrine was you will help fight communism anywhere, anytime, and you just lost. So what's up with that? So that's kind of the background to what's been going on with China. All right.
Yes, you're in deep doo now.
Yes, he was in deep doo. He had a problem. The communists and some American leaders saw that, or at least they felt like he was sort of weak. He could talk a good game, but he wasn't going to do anything. So here's a map that shows you where China, obviously, this big green, there's Indochina down below, and then China, and then there was Japan. The Philippines are down there. Korea is that little finger of land that comes down just below the word Korea. That's North and South Korea. At this time, it was just one country, Korea. So Korea was divided at the 38th parallel, similar to the way that we did Germany. Remember, Germany was divided into an east and a west, and the communists took over the east part, and they put together a communist government in East Germany, whereas the west, England, France, and the United States, created West Germany, and they put together a democratic capitalist society there. Well, the same thing happened in Korea. And so the Soviets controlled the north, the U.S. controlled the south, and it was sort of a standoff against those two. Each side would have liked total control. Now remember, we're in the back of the background of this is China had just become communist. And so there's a little more pressure there. So what do you think the Russians are telling the North Koreans here? Well, just think about it. They were told, hey, you know, Truman didn't do anything to stop the communists and Mao Zedong in China. And China is this massive country with huge amounts of natural resources. And what did the U.S. do? Nothing. So why do you think they would do something if you invaded South Korea and took it over and made Korea just one country? So the Soviet Union did not invade, but they supported and urged and told North Korea, hey, you go ahead and do this because it probably won't cause a big problem. U.S. probably won't do anything. But Truman, you know, it's always a word with games. Truman decides this isn't a civil war. This is not the North Koreans versus the South Koreans. This is the Soviet Union's doing, right? And so that in Truman's mind was a different sort of idea. Plus, remember, he was under a lot of pressure because people kept thinking that Truman was soft. He wasn't going to fight back. And so that was part of the reason why the Soviet Union urged North Korea to do it. And it's part of the reason why Truman is going to go, nope, we're not going to let that happen again because I'm already taking heat for what happened in China. So within days after the North Koreans invade, we start sending troops into South Korea to help them fight. Now, we didn't think this was going to happen. The Cold War generally, that's not what goes on. You don't invade a country because that turns into a hot war rather than a Cold War. And so because we weren't ready, things didn't go well. In fact, the North Koreans won battle after battle, and they pushed continually down from the north into the south. And while we were doing everything we could as quickly as we could, it took a while before actually we got our stuff together and said, okay, let's fix this. So you can see here in the map, the 38th parallel, which is that line that's going across that separated the north and the south. You can see how far the North Korean troops had invaded into the south, and in reality, just that little yellow section in the corner down there is where what was left of the South Korean army and what part of the U.S. Army controlled. So things were not looking good. So Truman sends Douglas MacArthur to save Korea. Now, remember, Douglas MacArthur was the guy who was in charge of the Pacific Fleet and the Pacific Theater of World War II. So he knew the area very well, and he knew how to fight wars, and he was very successful. He was an American war hero in World War II. So Truman puts him in charge. And within 2 weeks, we had driven back. And this was keyed by an invasion at the place you can see there, a little square called Incheon, just north and west of Seoul. Seoul is the capital of South Korea. So we did sort of a surprise sneak attack while the North Koreans were down near that little yellow dot around Busan. We came in around behind them and we did a D-Day kind of invasion at Incheon, and were able to cut the country in two. So all of those North Korean troops that were in the south, all of a sudden their supply lines dried up and they were in trouble. They were cut off from the support of the North. So it was a brilliant move by MacArthur, and done very well and secretly, and there's a lot of stories about Incheon and the success. None of these wars, none of these battles were bloodless. There was a lot of casualties. In fact, there's as many casualties for the U.S. in the Korean War, which happens over a period of 2 to 3 years, as there was in the Vietnam War, which went on for 7 or 8 years. So you can say that the level of casualties day by day was much higher in the Korean War than it was in the Vietnam War. It was a very bloody war. Anyways, so we're not going to go a lot into all the battles and all that kind of stuff, but you should know about Incheon and the amphibious attack that was done there, and basically caught the North Vietnamese unaware, or North Koreans, not North Vietnamese. So by 1950, the UN forces, that means the United States and our allies in other countries were helping us fight this fight. We crossed back over the 38th parallel, basically pushing the North Korean army back up into North Korea. And so we had success within that first year. This is good news for the Americans. And then MacArthur and the United States decided, well, if North Korea wanted to unite Korea and take over South Korea, hey, we're winning now. Why don't we just go and take North Korea and make it part of South Korea? We will unite Korea as one country, but it will be a capitalist, democratic country instead of a communist country. And so they thought, well, we can unify Korea. China then got involved, and remember, they're communist as well, and they said, if you do this, we will step in and we will begin to fight against you. So there was a threat of this war expanding, and there were people that had visions of a World War III or maybe a World War II Part 2. Where China and the Soviets would get involved, and then, of course, that would bring in all of our allies that are in Europe and Australia and other countries that were friends with us. So they said, we will do something if you don't stop. And so MacArthur, the Chinese did attack, and they pushed the American troops back to that DMZ, that stands for Demilitarized Zone. That was the 38th parallel, and you can see that dark line going across between North and South Korea. So the Chinese did come in, and we did retreat back to the 38th parallel. And MacArthur was not going to take this easily. He viewed this as a defeat, even though it was actually reestablishing things where they were supposedly before this whole thing started. MacArthur said, hey, we got this atomic bomb, and we could use this. And so he was ready to go out and do total, full-out war with China, not just North Korea. Truman said, nope, not a good idea. We're going to, well, remember, Truman already had a strategy. His strategy was containment. And he believed and was told, if you attack communism, it will spread and it will make it stronger, and it'll be harder to defeat. The best thing to do is containment. MacArthur didn't buy that. He said, no, we can attack. We can drop a few atomic bombs and China will back off and we can reunify Korea. He didn't want to take over China. He just wanted Korea to be unified. That was his objective. And so what happened was MacArthur came out publicly and said, this is wrong. We should attack China. They're attacking us. And Truman said, no, that's not going to happen. Now, if you know how the government works, the president is the commander-in-chief, and all the generals work under the president. So what happens in the military when you disagree with an order of the person above you? It doesn't turn out well. And so that's kind of what happened here. Truman fired MacArthur. He said,
You're fired.
Right. So this was really unpopular because Truman was a World War II hero. A lot of people believed that that MacArthur was the reason why we won the battle in the Pacific Ocean against the Japanese. And people were not really enthused with Truman. Truman was the vice president. He wasn't really seen as the general in charge of the war. And so he didn't have the credibility, he didn't have the reputation that maybe Roosevelt did. But Roosevelt died, left Truman in charge, but MacArthur had a reputation and the American people loved him. And because this happened in public, it was really unpopular. Truman took a big hit in his popularity, and MacArthur was actually invited to come to the U.S. Congress and give a farewell speech, which is sort of a slap in the face at the president. So, yeah, I mean, we have a lot of political disagreements that go on in the news today, but we had them back then. We've always had them. We just don't think they're quite as bad as they are now. We'll see that. So the Americans, the people all over the place were protesting MacArthur being fired and, get rid of Truman and, this is all wrong. So that swept across America. But it didn't matter. Truman stuck to his guns. The war would continue on for 3 more years. So the Korean War went from 1950 to 1953. Eventually, like I told you, we have 57,000 Americans who die in Vietnam, 54,000 in the Korean War. The difference is the Korean War was only half as long, actually a little less than half as long as the Vietnam War. 4 million Koreans were killed in this war because the war was fought in their territory by their soldiers on both sides. So massive amounts of casualties. Korea still is divided today. You can see the red is North Korea and the south. The yellow is South Korea. Pyongyang is the capital of North and Seoul is the capital of South. And there's been a lot in the news over the last few years. Remember, they're firing test missiles, and North Korea now has nuclear warheads, possibly even able to reach the United States. They've made threats. We've made threats back. This is why North Korea is not friendly to us. So most of the diplomacy that goes on between North Korea and the United States happens through China. As China has been more friendly to us. I'm not sure how that's going to go with this COVID virus thing. Obviously, a little more tension between the U.S. and China. But we keep asking China to, because they're friends, they have neighbor relations with North Korea, to put pressure on North Korea. So that's kind of what we are continuing to work through diplomacy, like Cold War diplomacy. We're trying to get North Korea to do what we want by putting pressure and working with their friends, which would be China. So that's still going on today. Gives you a little bit of history when you hear about North Korea, so you understand where all this division and animosity came from and why it's still there today. This is the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. These soldiers represent, Korea was a cold, rainy, it was a really horrible war weather-wise. It was fought, you see those lines going across underneath the soldiers, because the war was fought by parallels. Remember, the 38th parallel divided north from south, and you measured how the war was going by how many parallels or how many degrees of latitude that you could take. And so that's what the lines on the ground are for, to symbolize the lines of parallel. And so all of these different soldiers, they have their rain tunics on, they're carrying their gear. Lots of different soldiers' skills are represented in these. And these are bigger than life size. They're about 7.5 feet tall. If you stood next to them, you'd feel like they're giants. It's a really cool memorial. And it's right across the reflecting pond from the Vietnam Memorial. So there's this memorial, and then there's the reflecting pond in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and that's pretty famous. And you've seen a lot of pictures of that reflecting pond. On the other side of the reflecting pond is the Vietnam War Memorial. And that is it, friends. So with that, I'll let you go. Have a good day.